There are moments in history when time seems to bend, when the world exhales in silence, and reality shimmers with something unexplainable. The summer of 1518 in the city of Strasbourg was one such moment. Nestled along the banks of the river Ill, surrounded by wheat fields and timbered cottages, this quiet Alsatian town stood like a jewel within the crown of the Holy Roman Empire. Its cobblestone streets echoed with prayers and gossip, its cathedrals rising like fingers pointing toward the heavens. It was a place both ancient and devout, shaped by the push and pull of kingdoms, by war and religion, by saints and sickness. In this time, people believed in spirits that danced in the blood, in saints who healed through divine mercy, and in demons who whispered during sleep. The lines between body and soul, myth and medicine, blurred like breath on cold glass. And so when the first woman began to dance, alone, without music, in the heart of the city, few knew what they were witnessing. Her feet struck the earth in a feverish rhythm, her body convulsing not with joy but with agony. She danced as if possessed, lips trembling, eyes vacant, sweat pouring like summer rain. Hours passed, then days. She could not stop, and soon others joined. Within a week, dozens of bodies moved in unison across Strasbourg streets, dancing, collapsing, rising again. By the month's end, the number had swelled into the hundreds, and people began to die. The chroniclers of the time called it a choreomania, a dancing plague. But behind the ink of those ancient parchments lies a deeper truth, one woven with mystery, suffering, belief, and fear. This is the story of a forgotten hysteria, of bodies gripped by an unseen hand. It is the tale of a medieval world teetering on the edge of science and superstition, of a city praying for deliverance while echoing with the sound of shuffling feet. But more than that, it is a mirror. For in this tale, buried under centuries of dust and disbelief, we find something hauntingly human, the desperate need to move when words fail, the ache of fear when the world grows strange, the rhythm of history pulsing through our veins. Let us return to Strasbourg, to the summer of fever and footfall. Let us walk among its alleys, hear the bells tolling in the cathedral, feel the heat rising from stone. Let us listen to the footsteps of the damned, for the dance has begun. It began without thunder or trumpet. No omen cleaved the sky. No herald cried out in alarm. Just a woman, barefoot, in the summer sun, swaying where the cobblestones met the morning haze. Her name, if the records are to be believed, was Frau Trophia. She lived among the weavers and tanners, a common woman of no particular note. But for reasons lost to time, she stepped into the square and began to dance. At first, no one interfered. Perhaps they thought it a joke, or a moment of private madness best left alone. But as the hours passed and her limbs continued their strange, unrelenting rhythm, heads turned. She danced not with joy, but compulsion, her eyes unfocused, her jaw clenched, her feet pounding in defiance of flesh and fatigue. By dusk, she had collapsed. But when the sun rose, she returned, limping, shaking, drenched in sweat, and danced again. The townsfolk, bewildered and afraid, whispered that she was cursed. Others claimed she was punished for sin, or chosen by heaven to perform penance for them all. And then, she was no longer alone. By the end of the first week, nearly 30 people had joined her in the street. Men and women, young and old, each seized by the same invisible command. They spun in circles until their feet bled. They collapsed from exhaustion, only to rise again moments later, as though some force had tethered their souls to the rhythm of an unseen drum. No music played. No festival had been called. There was only the sound of feet against stone, of panting breath, of the groans of bodies pushed to their limits. Strasbourg was a city of stone and superstition. Half German, half French, it bore the stamp of imperial might and Christian fear. The citizens lived under the watchful gaze of the church, whose bells rang out from the towering cathedral like commands from God himself. Life here was rigid, filled with ritual and rot, where fasting and prayer offered protection from famine and plague. And yet, nothing in Scripture could explain what now unfolded in the city square. The local magistrates gathered in worry. Doctors were consulted, learned men dressed in robes, wielding scrolls and scalpels. Their diagnosis was as strange as the affliction itself. They claimed the dancers were suffering from hot blood, an excess of internal heat that must be drawn out through movement. In other words, the cure was more dancing. A stage was erected. Musicians were hired to accompany the afflicted. And the dancers, some weeping, some wailing, continued to move in agony under the Alsatian sun. This is where reason breaks and reality slips. For what kind of society responds to madness with melody? What desperation, what ancient fear must have guided the hands that tuned those instruments? But Strasbourg was no stranger to calamity. In the years leading to that summer, the region had suffered greatly. Failed harvests had brought famine. Disease had visited in waves, and war had marched its boots across the countryside more than once. The people were weary, their souls stretched thin by suffering, their minds teetering on the edge of collective collapse. And then the dancers came. Some saw them as possessed by demons. Others whispered of saints, particularly Saint Vitus, protector against epilepsy and all things ungovernable. Pilgrimages were organized to nearby shrines. Holy relics were carried through the streets. The priests chanted, incense rose in curls toward heaven, and still the dancers danced. Days passed into weeks. The city pulsed with fevered steps. The river glinted, indifferent. Birds perched upon rooftops and watched. People began to die. Hearts gave out from exhaustion. Feet split open and bled. Some fell mid-step and never rose again. Their bodies were carried away, but their places were taken by others. In total, some records say hundreds joined the dance. Others dispute the numbers. But the truth is not in the figures. It is in the tremor that ran through the soul of Strasbourg. It is in the fear that settled like dust upon the lips of every man, woman, and child who dared ask, "Will I be next?" Frau Trophia, the woman who began it all, vanished from history. Some said she died. Others believed she was taken to a mountaintop shrine and cured by holy water. But no grave bears her name. Only echoes. Reflecting upon that moment now, centuries later, we might ask, what truly seized her that day? Was it madness? Mass hysteria? A sickness of the spirit? Or was it something deeper, something ancient and buried, a cry from the bones of the earth itself? When a society is pushed beyond its limits, when the soul can no longer carry the weight of pain, the body may speak. It may scream. It may dance. And thus it began. The first chapter of the strangest epidemic in human memory, written not with ink, but with footfall and fever. The story of Strasbourg's dance is not merely about what was seen, but about what was felt, feared, and forgotten. And as the sun sets over the red roofs of Strasbourg, the sound of music no longer plays. But beneath the stone, beneath the centuries, something still moves. Let us descend further, into the minds of the doctors, the prayers of the clergy, the myths of the people. For the plague was far from over, and the dance had only just begun. The morning sun rose quietly over Strasbourg, casting long golden rays across the cobbled alleys and the moss-covered rooftops of timber-framed houses. The bells of the church tower tolled slowly, as if still reluctant to awaken. It was the 14th of July, in the year of our Lord 1518. From the shuttered windows, townsfolk stirred, bakers lit ovens, farmers gathered tools, and merchants prepared carts for market. All was as it had been for years, routine, predictable, and rooted in rhythms of the earth and the soul. But then, from one narrow lane at the edge of the city walls, came an unfamiliar rhythm. Not the hammering of a cobbler's tools or the clatter of hooves, but the steady, shuffling beat of bare feet against stone. She appeared without warning. A solitary woman, mid-aged, wrapped in a worn linen shift, her hair loose and damp from morning sweat. No flute guided her steps. No drummer summoned her movement. She simply danced, arms flailing with a jerking intensity. Her legs moved in rapid, skipping bursts. Her eyes were wide but unfocused, as if gazing through time itself. At first, those who passed her by paused in bewilderment. A peasant woman in distress? A madwoman touched by the devil? Children giggled nervously, hiding behind their mothers' skirts. Elders crossed themselves. No one approached her. No one dared. She danced through the square as hours passed. The morning became noon, and still she did not stop. Her face grew flushed. Blisters formed on her feet. Blood marked her steps. And yet, Her limbs continued their strange convulsion, her expression trapped somewhere between agony and ecstasy. By evening, a crowd had formed. Some whispered that she was possessed. Others believed she had been cursed by a saint or afflicted by a demon sent to punish the city. A few muttered about famine's toll on the mind. After all, Strasbourg had not been spared the cruelties of drought and hunger. What if the body had simply snapped, unable to bear the weight of starvation and sin? Still, the dancing did not cease. As dusk settled and candles flickered to life in windows above, the woman finally collapsed. Her breath heaved. Her body trembled, soaked in sweat. But as the night deepened and the stars turned overhead, she rose again and began once more. Her name, recorded in the faded ink of a priest's journal, was Frau Trophia. Her identity remained shrouded in mystery, but she would become the spark that lit an unholy fire. Within days, more dancers joined her. 1 became 3, 3 became 7, then a dozen. Men, women, even children, caught in a trance of endless movement. The city, so accustomed to order, now watched in helpless horror as its own streets became stages for something inexplicable. No revelry, no music, only the sound of flesh meeting stone, shoes thudding, lungs gasping, and an eerie silence that followed when bodies dropped, only to rise again. What had begun as isolated madness now spread like contagion, without touch, without word. It was as if the city had fallen into a collective spell. Priests prayed louder. Physicians consulted the stars. Scholars searched ancient scrolls for meaning. But still, the dancing grew. Historians would later suggest that mass psychogenic illness might explain it, a phenomenon where stress and suffering, combined with shared belief, erupts in a physical form. But even this fails to satisfy the deeper unease the event inspires. Why dancing? Why movement without joy? Why agony without resistance? One theory traced its roots to Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr whose name became associated with spasms and seizures. Perhaps these dancers believed themselves cursed by the saint's wrath, condemned to move until mercy intervened. Or perhaps they danced in supplication, seeking deliverance through suffering. As the days passed, Strasbourg's leaders grew desperate. Some called for exorcisms, others for isolation. But in a decision both strange and strangely logical, the city's magistrates chose to embrace the madness. If the dancers could not stop, then perhaps they should be allowed, encouraged even, to dance the madness out. A wooden stage was erected. Musicians were hired. Pipes and drums filled the air. The afflicted were brought together in a central location, watched, but not restrained. They danced under the sun, under the stars, through rain and heat, until the soles of their feet split open, until they collapsed from exhaustion. Some died. Their bodies laid still at last. But others rose and kept dancing. What did the citizens feel as they watched? Pity? Horror? Or did some feel a pull, a dangerous kinship with the rhythm? Perhaps, beneath the surface, the dance was not madness at all, but a mirror, reflecting a deeper unrest, a spiritual famine, a trembling need to move when the world had stood too still for too long. Frau Trophia's strange journey would be remembered, but the wave she began had only just begun to swell. The weeks ahead would reveal darker turns. Physicians would grow frantic, clergy would grow fearful, and the dance itself would become a question that echoed through time. To understand it, we must look not only at the plague itself, but at the soil in which it grew, at the hunger, the sorrow, the silence. It was not the music that caused her to fall. It was not even exhaustion, though her body trembled from the endless hours. It was something deeper and unraveling, as if the mind had finally snapped the strings that tethered it to the body. On the third day, Frau Trophia dropped to her knees in the street, arms slack, eyes wide open to a sky that refused to answer. Her feet were bloodied now, her slippers long worn to threads. She collapsed not with grace, but with the weight of something ancient, an echo of sorrow long dormant, awakened again in her trembling form. But she did not stop. The town square had changed since her dance began. Where once merchants shouted their prices and children chased hens through cobbled lanes, now there was silence, broken only by the rhythmic thud of her feet. Some watched from windows. Others gathered in the square, their faces pale and confused. And then another joined her. A man, middle-aged and sturdy, took to the street beside her and began to mirror her madness. No music, no ritual, only movement, only the compulsion. Within days, others followed. One by one, they stepped into the invisible circle, swept up by a force they could not name. Their faces bore no joy, only fatigue, confusion, and terror. Some wept even as they danced. Some muttered prayers. Others screamed, not from pain, but from the horror of losing control. The church was the first to speak. Atop the pulpit, the priests proclaimed it a punishment, a chastisement from heaven for the sins of the people. Had they not grown indulgent? Had they not forgotten humility, abandoned the path of righteousness for the lures of the flesh? The bishop ordered the ringing of bells, the fasting of households, and the recitation of litanies. Yet still the dancers grew in number. 40, then 50, then nearly 100. Strasbourg had never seen such a thing. This was not theater, not celebration. These were not jesters. They were bakers and farmers, mothers and merchants, flailing in the dust. Soon, death came. A young girl, no more than 17, collapsed with her arms twisted mid-spin. She had danced for 2 days straight. Her breath gave out. Her heart stopped. And there, on the stones of the square, she passed into the stillness she could not find in life. Others followed. Men fell with their eyes wide open. A pregnant woman lost her child as her body shook uncontrollably. The city kept a tally, not of births, not of marriages, but of those who died dancing. The town council, now desperate, turned to physicians. Learned men from Basel and beyond arrived, their coats stiff with authority. They studied the dancers like insects. Their conclusion was as strange as the plague itself. It was not a curse, they claimed, but an affliction of the blood, a fever of the humors, a physical imbalance. The cure, they said, was more dancing. More dancing. And so, they cleared space in the town square. Musicians were summoned. Drummers, pipers, fiddlers. Platforms were built. Dancers were herded together like cattle and told to continue. Under the watch of guards and clergy, they twirled and stumbled and sweated under the Alsatian sun. It was a grotesque masquerade, death wearing the mask of celebration. Here was the paradox. The more they danced, the more they died. The treatment only fed the madness. The square became a theater of suffering, and the streets reeked of sweat, blood, and despair. But amidst the horror, one question echoed. Why? Why had this begun? Why Frau Trophia? Why this town in this year? What unseen hand had stirred the air? What whisper from beneath the veil had called these people to rise and spin without end? In the silent hours between midnight and dawn, when the drums ceased and only ragged breathing remained, some began to speak of Saint Vitus. He was the patron of dancers. A martyr who, centuries earlier, had died defiant and pure. His name had long been invoked against epilepsy, convulsions, and the trembling of limbs. Now, his cult was remembered with new urgency. Perhaps, it was whispered, these dancers were possessed. Perhaps they had angered Vitus. Or perhaps they were chosen by him. Pilgrimages were planned, offerings made, but nothing quelled the rhythm that pulsed through the town. Even the river watched. The Ill, flowing quiet and cold along the edge of Strasbourg, reflected the torchlight and trembled with the footfalls. It had seen plague and famine, siege and slaughter. But never this. Never a city dancing itself to ruin. Historians would later speak of mass psychosis, of shared trauma and psychological contagion. They would name the famine, the pestilence, the poverty. They would measure the madness in footnotes and theory. But they were not there. They did not hear the gasps of breathless dancers. They did not see the bloodied footprints vanish into morning mist. They did not smell the incense clashing with sweat, the perfume of desperation. Only Strasbourg remembers, and it remembers in silence. As July deepened, the city held its breath. Would the plague end? Would reason return? Or was this simply the beginning of something far older, a rhythm buried in the bones of civilization, rising again like a song no one remembered learning? For now, the feet moved, the hearts raced, and the questions remained unanswered. Tomorrow would bring more dancers, and more collapse. And so they moved, not with joy, nor to rhythm, but as if pulled by the invisible strings of some unseen tormentor. The bodies did not move like dancers. They twitched, collapsed, trembled. Their arms flailed not in celebration, but in desperation. There was no music, only the sound of heels slamming against the stone, of gasping breaths and muted sobs. By now, the heat of the Alsatian summer hung thick in the streets of Strasbourg. Dust clung to sweating skin, and the smell of human exhaustion settled into the square like a second atmosphere. In the very heart of this suffocating reality, the dancers pressed on. They danced day and night, many without rest. Eyewitnesses described eyes vacant of reason, limbs moving as if detached from will. Some foamed at the mouth, some screamed mid-step. Others prayed with their feet, invoking saints as they collapsed in fits of motion. But none could stop. Physicians, summoned from nearby abbeys and councils, stood baffled. This was no ordinary illness, they declared. No fever, no pox, no plague. These were not witches, nor heretics, they insisted, though whispers of demonic possession crept through the alleyways like a rising fog. Instead, they blamed an excess of blood, a humoral imbalance that, in the language of Galenic medicine, overheated the brain and body. The treatment? More dancing. Better to let the sickness bleed itself out, to let the motion run its course. So the town erected a stage. Musicians were summoned, and to the haunting sound of flutes and drums, the afflicted continued their descent into rhythmic oblivion. It was then that the dancing began to consume not just the street, but the city itself. Housewives left their kitchens mid-meal. Butchers dropped their knives. Children wandered into the square and were never seen standing still again. The phenomenon spread. From a single woman came hundreds. Some estimates claimed as many as 400 were overtaken by the urge to dance. Their bodies moved without command, their minds caught between trance and terror. Medieval chroniclers described it in a tone of bewildered reverence. This was not entertainment. It was not rebellion. It was a haunting, a possession of the flesh by something older than reason. Some danced until their feet bled through their shoes. Some collapsed from exhaustion, only to rise again moments later, compelled as though by divine force. Others fell dead where they moved, hearts ruptured, lungs emptied, minds shattered. And the town watched. What else could they do? In this madness, the line between the sacred and profane blurred. Priests stood beside fiddlers, physicians beside weeping mothers. All tried to make sense of the impossible. Some believed it was the curse of Saint Vitus, a saint said to punish sinners through convulsions of the body. The afflicted, they claimed, were vessels of collective guilt. Their dance was a ritual of atonement, a cleansing fire in human form. Others whispered darker things. They spoke of forgotten pagan rites, of ecstatic trance once practiced under full moons, now reawakened. Some blamed the devil himself, dancing his way through Christian Europe in flesh and frenzy. Still others looked inward. They saw, in the dancers, a mirror of society's wounds, of famine and fear, of war and plague, of a people so worn by grief that their sorrow spilled into motion. The body, after all, remembers what the mind cannot hold. In a world governed by harsh winters, empty granaries, and merciless disease, perhaps it was no mystery that the body sought escape, any escape, even if it meant dancing until death. And so the dance continued, looping through the city like a cursed melody that could not be silenced. At night, the square echoed with ghostly rhythms. By candlelight, their silhouettes spun like phantoms. The stars above bore silent witness. And still they danced. What force could animate so many? What weight of sorrow could drive an entire community into such unrelenting motion? In these questions, we find not just medieval mystery, but a reflection of the fragile threshold between mind and body, between spirit and despair. And as we look back on Strasbourg's summer of delirium, we begin to sense this was not simply an outbreak. It was a manifestation, a language without words, a scream without sound, a convulsion of history. When medicine fails, when reason trembles, there, the church kneels. The bells of Strasbourg rang not just to mark the hour, but to call the soul. Their tolling echoed across rooftops and alleyways, over the city walls, and into the surrounding hills. But in the summer of 1518, their song was swallowed by the sound of feet. Feet that would not still, bodies that would not rest. From the high windows of the cathedral, the clergy looked down upon the dancers with a silence born not of ignorance, but of ancient dread. For what moved in the square below was no mere ailment of the flesh. It was a challenge to the order of heaven and earth. They had seen the sick before, the bleeding, the coughing, the pox-stricken and pale. They had walked through plague-strewn streets with crucifixes held high, had buried the dead by the hundreds. But this was something else. These were not bodies broken by disease. They were possessed by motion. They moved as if bewitched by sound no one else could hear. A heresy not spoken, but danced. The bishop convened his council. In cloistered rooms, men in red and gold debated scripture, searched for precedent. Was this the work of the devil? Was it divine punishment for some hidden sin? The people, too, demanded answers. They lit candles before statues of the Virgin. They whispered prayers in shadowed chapels. Mothers placed rosaries into the trembling hands of their dancing children. Fathers wept beside the altars, their eyes hollow with helplessness. And through it all, the church watched. One by one, the dancers began to die. Heart failure, stroke, exhaustion. Their bodies fell mid-motion, like puppets whose strings had snapped. The square became not a dance floor, but a graveyard of unburied sorrow. At last, the church could wait no longer. A decree was issued. The stage and musicians were to be removed. No more instruments, no more rhythms. The plague of dancing must not be fed, it must be starved of sound. The sick would be gathered and taken far from the city, to a shrine, to a saint, to Saint Vitus, the patron of dancers, the protector of the afflicted. So began the solemn procession. One by one, the dancers were led from Strasbourg, not in triumph, but in silence. Some limped, some had to be carried. Others still danced, feebly, haltingly, as if their bodies no longer knew how to be still. Through forests and fields they moved, escorted by clerics and guards. Behind them, the city exhaled, relieved, uncertain, afraid. The shrine of Saint Vitus stood nestled in the countryside, surrounded by oak and ash. A humble chapel, weathered by centuries of prayer. Here, the afflicted were laid upon the stone floor. The priests prayed over them. Holy water was sprinkled. Incense filled the air. Then, in a ritual as old as the saint himself, red shoes were placed upon the feet of the dancers. Shoes anointed with oil. Shoes meant to bind the madness, to break its hold. Some screamed as the shoes touched their skin. Others wept. And some, in that stillness, finally stopped moving. Whether by faith, fatigue, or fate, the dancing began to subside. The church had spoken, and the city, for a time, was quiet. But silence does not always mean peace. In the following weeks, the clergy urged penance. Processions were held. Saints' days observed with new fervor. Whispers of divine warning drifted through Strasbourg like mist. The people walked more cautiously now, laughed more quietly, danced no longer. But fear had already taken root. And where fear lives, it grows. Not all in the church agreed on what had passed. Some believed it was divine wrath. Others, demonic temptation. Still others wondered, quietly, dangerously, whether this was something new, a madness of the mind, a sorrow too great to bear. In letters preserved in monasteries and abbeys, records began to appear. Mentions of dancing plagues in other towns in earlier years. Aachen, Liege, Metz. Was Strasbourg only the latest? Or was it a warning? Even as the candles flickered before the altar of Saint Vitus, the question remained. Had the church truly quelled the storm? Or merely silenced its echo until next time? For in the hearts of the people, something had shifted. They had seen their neighbors dance to death, and they would never look at a footstep the same way again. There is a force older than medicine, older than myth, one born not of microbes or stars, but of the trembling bond between souls. It is the contagion of behavior, the subtle and electric dance of the human mind when it finds itself in the presence of another. It spreads not through blood or breath, but through eyes, gestures, and the silent longing to belong. In the hot summer of 1518, as bodies spun and limbs collapsed in the alleys of Strasbourg, this invisible chain of mimicry, this dark mirror of empathy, was perhaps the most potent pathogen of all. Modern science would name it mass psychogenic illness. But that cold term does little justice to the storm of terror and awe that swept through the city. As Frau Trophia danced, others watched. Then others joined, not in joy or celebration, but as if their bodies had been lured into a puppet's trance. What began with one woman became 10, then 30, then hundreds. Not with music, not with rhythm, but with a trembling desperation, a feverish, involuntary swirl. In the cloistered minds of Renaissance Europe, explanation was rarely separate from the sacred. When physicians failed to identify poisons or plagues, they looked to the humors, to melancholy and heat, to the idea that an imbalance of bodily elements could set the soul afire. But there was another theory taking shape, that the dance itself was not affliction, but expression, an embodied echo of suffering too deep for words. And so they observed, the dancers were not from the upper classes. They were mothers and weavers, beggars and masons. Their lives were etched with hunger, taxation, war, and pestilence. The harvests had failed. The waters had risen. Prices soared while wages crumbled. The soul of Strasbourg was frayed. And in the midst of this exhaustion, spiritual, physical, and communal, the body found its rebellion in the most absurd of forms, dance. Like birds startled into flight by unseen thunder, people leapt into motion without understanding why. Some did not want to dance. They wept as they spun. They begged to be stopped. But something in them had surrendered control. Was it suggestion? Was it sympathy? Was it the desperate instinct to find unity in shared agony? What we now call mirror neurons, those delicate circuits that cause us to flinch when others are struck, to smile when we see joy, may have played their role. In a tightly woven community, these neural imitations can blossom into epidemic. Like fire through dry grass, the urge spreads from eye to limb, from rhythm to breath. Not all were susceptible, but enough were. Enough to make the miracle, or curse, feel real. The city council, fearing divine wrath, initially brought in minstrels and built wooden stages, hoping music might pacify the frenzy. But this prescription only deepened the trance. The dancers now had rhythm. Drums beat like distant thunder over cobblestones. Flutes traced serpentine melodies through windows and alleys. The very air began to pulse. If dancing was a fire, they had poured oil upon it. Some dancers collapsed from exhaustion. Others died, not ceremoniously, but in the gutters and dust of Strasbourg streets. Witnesses spoke of men with bleeding feet, of women who screamed as they twirled, of children unable to still their limbs. The madness did not discriminate. It reached into homes and markets, touched the devout and the doubtful alike. Religious officials offered their interpretations. Some claimed the dancers were seized by the wrath of Saint Vitus, a martyr associated with convulsions and trembling. Others believed the town had fallen under the enchantment of demons or witches. In an age when the line between spirit and sickness was blurred, such explanations felt no less scientific than humors or poisons. But what if the explanation was simpler, more human? What if the plague was not one of contagion, but of catharsis, a collective release, an ancient and unconscious ritual enacted through muscle and marrow? Anthropologists have found echoes of such episodes in other cultures. In Java, in Africa, in medieval Italy, there are records of tarantism and spirit possession, of communal trances erupting after drought, war, or injustice. Perhaps Strasbourg was not alone, only more visible, more remembered. The philosopher Michel de Montaigne once mused that man is most brutish when he seeks order in things that are by nature chaotic. And here, in the mystery of the dancing plague, we see that urge at war with itself. The mind reaches for logic, for diagnosis. But the heart recognizes something else, the strange poetry of bodies echoing one another, of suffering becoming movement, of fear becoming rhythm. Was it madness? Was it grief? Or were they, in some desperate way, dancing not just to die, but to be seen? To express what could not be spoken in a time when the soul was owned by the church, the body taxed by the crown, and the earth failing to feed them? In their spinning agony, the dancers became both spectacle and symbol. They were the fever dream of a world unraveling. They were Strasbourg's mirror, each step a revelation of the city's buried despair. And as their numbers grew, so did the questions. Could one body affect another? Could pain ripple across a crowd, like wind across wheat? Could fear be choreographed? As we gaze backward through time, we often search for villains or heroes. But in the dancing plague, we find neither. Only people, fragile and bewildered, trying to survive a world that made little sense. And in that vulnerability, perhaps, lies the deepest humanity of all. Let us walk now into the darker chapters, for the authorities would soon lose patience. The church would grow stern, and what had begun as dance would begin to be treated as heresy, rebellion, or plague. There was no orchestra in the square of Strasbourg in 1518. No lute, no pipe, no tambourine. And yet, the rhythm persisted. Feet stamped upon the cobblestones as if guided by a phantom melody. Arms twirled in the air, not to the call of a drum, but to something else, something deep, unspoken, and untraceable. The question that hovered like incense over a cathedral was simple and yet maddening. What were they dancing to? Some said it was the devil's choir, hidden just beyond the veil of human hearing. Others claimed it was the rhythm of the earth itself, pulsing beneath the soil like the heart of a sleeping god. More still blamed cosmic imbalance, the alignment of Saturn and Mars, or the wrath of Venus spurned. But all of this was speculation. The truth danced just out of reach, like the dancers themselves. At this point in July, the epidemic had reached a fever pitch. As many as 400 people moved through the city in manic waves of dance. They danced by daylight and by starlight. They danced through meals, through mass, through thunder and rain. And the city watched with a mix of horror and helplessness. It was then that the physicians of Strasbourg convened. Learned men with furrowed brows, wrapped in robes heavy with ink and speculation. They examined the afflicted, not with pity but with the detachment of a society that feared the irrational more than the deadly. Their conclusion was not possession, nor witchcraft, nor plague. Instead, they declared it to be an excess of hot blood, a humoral imbalance. The body was overheated, they said, and must be cooled not by stillness, but by movement. They believed the only remedy was to dance the illness out. So the city, desperate and obedient, built a stage. They cleared a market square, erected a platform, and even hired musicians to accompany the afflicted. And so the dancers were herded not into hospitals, but into spectacle. Drummers and fiddlers played not out of joy, but obligation. They were the unwilling orchestra for an unwilling performance. What a curious sight it must have been. The sun rising over rooftops stained with soot and prayer. Dancers moving not in jubilation, but agony. Blood soaked through their shoes, but the music drove them forward. Some collapsed and were carried away, only for others to take their place. Children wept at the sight of their mothers writhing like marionettes with severed strings. The air stank of sweat and dread. And still, the music played. Perhaps no chapter in the story of the dancing plague is more surreal than this. The very idea of hiring musicians to feed the fire instead of extinguishing it speaks to the limitations of knowledge in a world still gripped by medieval beliefs. It also speaks to the terrifying authority of doctors in a time before microscopes, when a diagnosis could be as much curse as cure. There were those who whispered that this was no cure but cruelty. That playing music for the sick was like singing lullabies to the drowning. And yet the drums beat on. What other choice was there in an age when fear had no rival but the will to control it? It is in this paradox, where music meant healing and healing meant more dancing, that the full absurdity and tragedy of Strasbourg's response becomes clear. In trying to treat the madness, they amplified it. In seeking to understand, they became part of the performance. The doctors became composers, the city a stage, and the afflicted unwilling dancers in a play no one wrote. In retrospect, we see it clearly. The medical understanding of the 16th century, rooted in Galenic theories and superstition, could not grasp the storm brewing in the collective mind of the city. No stethoscope could detect the rhythm of fear. No herb could cure a soul overwhelmed by centuries of anxiety, hunger, and divine terror. And so they danced. And the music that never should have been played only deepened the silence beneath it all. Today, historians debate the root cause of the dancing. Was it ergot poisoning, fungus-laced bread inducing visions and convulsions? Was it mass hysteria, the body responding to a psychic scream too large to be voiced? Or was it, perhaps, a social phenomenon so rare and so complex that it defies the categories we try to force upon it? But back then, there was no time for theories. Only movement, only rhythm, only a city trying to cure a wound it could not see by feeding it music. And thus, in the height of summer, Beneath the Gothic shadows of Strasbourg Cathedral, a strange kind of theater played out. One with no script, no intermission, and no known end. The dancers did not bow. They collapsed, and still the drums echoed. In the stillness of night, when the musicians laid down their bows, the rhythm did not stop. It had moved into the hearts of the city's people. A collective fever had taken root, and Strasbourg no longer knew the difference between music and silence, illness and ritual. As August loomed, and the dead began to outnumber the living dancers, the city would begin to reconsider its approach. The drums would eventually fall silent. But for now, the plague played on. The dance had become a mirror, and what it reflected was not madness, but a culture drowning in unanswered prayers. A city trying to sing its way out of silence. A body politic twisting in rhythm with a soul it no longer recognized. The stage was set for a new chapter, and somewhere in the crowd, a drumbeat faltered. The music, like the sickness, had become unbearable, and from that silence, the city would be forced to listen differently. In the tapestry of 16th-century Alsace, threads of faith and fear were tightly woven together. In the wake of the dance, as Strasbourg quivered beneath the weight of its mystery, the people clung to their saints, not just as symbols of grace, but as sentinels of salvation. The world was steeped in sacred rhythms. Bells chimed from cathedral spires. Candles flickered before statues with tear-stained cheeks. Psalms echoed down alleys where, just days prior, feet had pounded in a dance of desperation. Among the most fervently invoked was Saint Vitus, the martyred youth whose legend echoed from Sicily to Saxony. He had long been associated with healing convulsions and mental torment. His name had become synonymous with unexplainable fits of movement, even giving rise to the term Saint Vitus dance in medieval medicine. Now, the people of Strasbourg looked to him with both hope and dread. Was he their savior or their punisher? In those days, the line between piety and panic blurred easily. With physicians, magistrates, and clergy at odds over the cause of the plague, the city's leaders turned increasingly toward the divine. Monasteries became gathering places not just for monks, but for the desperate, the grieving, and the trembling. They prayed for absolution, for wisdom, for peace. But above all, they prayed that the dancing would stop. Amid this spiritual unrest, a pilgrimage was organized to the shrine of Saint Vitus in nearby Savour. Those who had danced, now gaunt, pale, and exhausted, were sent there as if in exile. They wore red shoes upon their blistered feet, as prescribed by tradition. Some limped beside ox-drawn carts. Others were carried by grieving relatives. The journey became both penance and ritual. The rhythm of their footsteps, slow and heavy, replaced the frenzied beat of their former convulsions. At the chapel, priests anointed the afflicted with holy water. Relics were pressed to their skin, splinters of the true cross, vials of saintly bone dust. Litanies filled the space between incense smoke and whispered fears. It was here, at the intersection of suffering and sanctity, that the hysteria began to ebb, or so the chronicles claim. But not all believed the affliction to be purely spiritual. A new theory began to rise among those educated in the ancient and the alchemical. They suggested the cause might lie in the body, not the soul. That a miasma, an invisible corruption in the air, or perhaps a poison hidden in the harvest had altered the mind. Ergot, a fungus that grew on damp rye, was known to cause hallucinations, spasms, and madness. It could mimic visions of the divine. It could inspire dread. Still, even this idea had its roots in religious thought. For what else was a poisoned body, if not a reflection of a poisoned spirit? The belief that sin could be somatic, that the body could bear the marks of divine displeasure, was deeply embedded in the worldview of the time. If they had danced, then surely it was because God had willed them to, or perhaps the devil had slipped into the soil. And so Strasbourg teetered between theology and medicine, between incense and tincture, between exorcism and examination. The afflicted were caught in a liminal state, as much symbols as sufferers. Their limbs had become battlegrounds where unseen forces clashed. Some began to recover. Others relapsed. A few vanished into the countryside, their fates unrecorded. To understand the resonance of the plague, one must grasp how intertwined faith was with the body. In an age before germ theory, sickness was rarely random. Disease was often a message, an omen, or a curse. And if it was a curse, there must be a reason. The people sought scapegoats. Was it the musicians who stirred too wild a rhythm? Was it the women who danced too long or too freely? Was it foreigners, heretics, witches? In their search for purity, the innocent often bore the brunt. A midwife was accused of summoning demons with dance. A traveling bard was jailed for playing a tune believed to mimic the devil's heartbeat. Superstition seeped into law, and fear carved itself into stone. Yet through it all, the people still prayed, still lit candles, still believed. For belief was the architecture of survival. Whether or not St. Vitus had truly intervened, it was easier to imagine a world ruled by saints than by chaos. Over time, the memories softened into story. Chronicles recorded the events in brief, sterile phrases. In the year of our Lord 1518, many were seized by dancing mania. But in the alleys and hearths of Strasbourg, the tale took on new shape. The dancers became symbols of warning, of mystery, of what happens when society forgets to listen to its own body. There is a strange poetry in the idea that healing came not just from fasting or penance, but from pilgrimage. That to walk, intentionally, rhythmically, reverently, could reverse what uncontrolled movement had unleashed. That the cure for chaos was order. That meaning could be restored by walking toward the sacred, one painful step at a time. In the quiet of that chapel in Saverne, with wax dripping from votive candles and footsteps echoing off worn flagstones, Strasbourg's dancers finally found stillness. Whether healed by the divine, the distance, or the sheer exhaustion of suffering, no one could say. But the music within them fell silent. And yet, even silence echoes. As the next chapter in our tale unfolds, we will journey beyond Strasbourg to explore other places where the rhythm of hysteria pulsed through the human soul. For the dance of 1518 was not the only one. There were other steps, other songs, other bodies seized by movement. And through them all, humanity kept asking the same question. Why does the body remember what the mind cannot explain? By the time July reached its middle stretch, the dancing had grown into a wildfire of limbs and musicless motion. The streets of Strasbourg pulsed with unbidden rhythm. The magistrates, having tried religion, penance, and music, now turned to the secular mind, to the physicians. Men of knowledge, dressed in black cloaks and stiff collars, arrived with scrolls and instruments, their brows furrowed as they studied the spectacle. These were the university-trained men, schooled in the medical texts of Galen and Hippocrates. Their belief in the humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, was the prevailing lens through which they viewed the body. To them, illness was imbalance. Fever, melancholy, hysteria, all could be understood through this prism of fluids and temperaments. What they saw in the dancers, however, was beyond their charts. Women in soiled dresses moving in frantic circles. Men with bloodied feet and cracked ribs, yet unable to stop. Some shouted for mercy while their bodies refused to obey. Others smiled through tears as though trapped in a dream they could not wake from. The physicians declared it an affliction of the blood. They spoke of overheated hearts, of bodies poisoned by summer's intensity. One wrote in his records that the sun had drawn forth inner madness, that the heat had evaporated reason. The solution, then, must be to bleed them. So they began. Dozens of dancers were taken into chambers, veins opened with careful precision. Blood drained into basins as the patient thrashed, not from fear, but from the dance that gripped them still. Some fainted, others wept, but the bloodletting did little to halt the rhythm. When bleeding failed, they turned to poultices and herbs. Combinations of wormwood, mugwort, valerian root, meant to cool the body and soothe the soul, were applied. Rooms were filled with the pungent smoke of burned rosemary, believed to purify air and thought. Yet outside the infirmaries, more people joined the dance. Physicians disagreed among themselves. Some whispered of hysteria, a feminine affliction rooted in the womb's supposed wanderings. Others suspected divine punishment, or perhaps demonic possession. None dared say it aloud, but many feared it might be contagious, not through the air, but through the eye and the mind. The town council, desperate, ordered that those most afflicted be removed from the city. They were loaded onto carts, their bodies still twitching, and taken into the countryside. There, under the shadow of mountain monasteries, monks would pray for their recovery. But the fields offered no cure. One physician, Paracelsus, a controversial thinker of the era, spoke of unseen poisons and spiritual toxins. He believed that the soul could become diseased and that the mind could infect the flesh. Though ridiculed by many, his ideas whispered of something modern, a foreshadowing of trauma, stress, and collective madness. Still, the city clung to old explanations. One physician wrote that the dancers had been seized by choreomania, a term blending the Greek for dance, chorea, and madness, mania. But the label offered no solution. It named the symptom, but not the cause. As the month drew to a close, the doctors had no answers. Their remedies, bleeding, purging, chanting, incense, had failed. The people of Strasbourg watched their scholars and surgeons falter, and faith in the learned men began to erode. What good were their books if they could not still the feet of a dancing child? There is something haunting in the image of a doctor holding a quill while a woman pirouettes in agony. Knowledge is a lantern, but in times like these, it often casts longer shadows than light. Historians would later write that this moment marked a collision of worlds, the scientific and the spiritual, the empirical and the unknowable. And in the smoke-filled streets of 1518, the limits of reason were laid bare. The physicians retreated, their silence louder than their cures. Strasbourg remained in the grip of the dance, and the people turned elsewhere for hope. For when logic falters, ritual often returns. The next chapter would not be written in books of medicine, but in chants and relics, in candles lit beneath the feet of saints. Thus ended the reign of the doctors, and the return of older faiths. In the silence they left behind, the dancers kept moving. When reason failed, when doctors folded their hands and bloodletting proved useless, the people of Strasbourg turned their gaze once more toward the sacred. They turned not toward cathedrals or kings, but toward a name whispered on ancient lips, a name older than the plague itself, Saint Vitus. Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers and the afflicted. In southern Germany, he was often invoked by those suffering seizures, tremors, or strange compulsions of the body. His name had long been associated with sacred madness, a paradox that made sense only in a medieval world where miracles and curses coiled around each other like vines. The people remembered him now. They remembered stories of pilgrims who traveled to his chapels and emerged healed. They remembered the holy spring said to run beneath his shrine in Saverne, not far from Strasbourg, where sacred water mingled with legend. And so they went. They carried the afflicted, some still dancing, others broken by exhaustion, to the shrine of Saint Vitus in a slow procession. Their feet kicked up the summer dust along the roads, while bells tolled in somber rhythm behind them. In the cart beds lay the pale and the blistered, their legs twitching to unheard melodies. The shrine was nestled in a grove of trees, its stones worn smooth by centuries of fingers seeking blessing. It was here that hope was once again given shape. Through ritual, through relic, through prayer. The monks greeted them, not with surprise, but with solemn resignation. They had seen this before. A century earlier, in the Rhine Valley, and again near Aachen, dancing madness had struck. And in each case, the faithful came to Saint Vitus. Within the shrine's dark stone walls, candles flickered. The dancers were brought before the altar. Priests placed holy relics on their chests, bone fragments said to be from the saint himself. Prayers were whispered over their bodies. Some cried out. Some sang. Some collapsed into sleep for the first time in days. Here, there was no attempt to analyze or dissect the illness. The shrine did not question, it embraced. Where physicians had measured pulses and drawn blood, the priests offered psalms and absolution. The body was not a system to be fixed, but a vessel to be cleansed. At night, hymns echoed through the grove. Monks led vigils by torchlight. Pilgrims, even those not afflicted, came to watch and pray. Some feared the dancers. Others saw them as saints touched by a mystery beyond comprehension. The rituals were ancient, drawn from layers of pagan and Christian traditions. In some ceremonies, the dancers' shoes were removed and burned, symbolically shedding the madness. In others, ribbons were tied around their ankles, colored red to invoke protection. There were those who began to quiet. After days of prayer and rest, their limbs grew still. The music in their minds seemed to fade, leaving behind silence like the cooling of a fever. And yet, not all were healed. For some, the dance had gone too deep. Even in sleep, their legs twitched. Even in silence, they hummed rhythms beneath their breath. Their minds remained adrift in that half-world between ecstasy and torment. The shrine could not save everyone, but it gave the people what they needed most: a story, a meaning, a vessel for the madness. To say that St. Vitus had struck them, or even protected them, was easier than saying the world had cracked. The city, too, began to recover. With many of the dancers removed to the countryside, Strasbourg grew quieter. The streets lost their feverish pulse. Merchants reopened their stalls. Bells rang once more for market days, not for mourning. But the memory lingered. In taverns, men told tales of the girl who danced until her knees shattered. In chapels, candles were lit for the souls of the dead. In quiet homes, mothers watched their daughters more carefully, listening for the first tap of an imaginary rhythm. And every year, on the feast of St. Vitus, the city remembered. They marched in silent procession to the chapel, not to celebrate, but to remind themselves of what had passed, and how close they had come to something unspeakable. The story of 1518 did not vanish. It became legend, and like all legends, it shaped the city's soul. The shrine of St. Vitus remains to this day. Its stones hold the echoes of that summer. Whispers of footsteps, the soft rustle of cloth against sweating skin, the murmured pleas of those who danced too long. Some say if you walk the path there at dusk, and the wind is just right, you can still hear the beat. Not drums, not music, just the sound of memory, tapping softly at the edges of history. And still we wonder, was it miracle? Madness? A message from beneath the veil? Or was it simply what happens when a city breaks, and all it can do is dance? By the 11th week of dancing, the plague had become something more than a phenomenon. It was now a reckoning. The church, that solemn gatekeeper of divine order and cosmic morality, could no longer ignore the gyrating masses that thrashed upon the stone arteries of Strasbourg. As bells tolled for matins and vespers, so too did feet fall relentlessly upon the cobblestones, blurring prayer with panic, piety with possession. The clergy gathered in cloistered halls, the scent of beeswax candles thick in the air, whispering about saints and sins, about demons that slipped through the cracks of mortal resolve. A council was formed, not of physicians or merchants, but of priests and bishops, charged with discerning whether Strasbourg had become host to a spiritual contagion. They scoured ancient tomes. The Malleus Maleficarum, that grim guide to witchcraft and heresy, was thumbed and read with nervous reverence. Writings of Augustine, Aquinas, and forgotten mystics were summoned from the cathedral library like sacred weapons. The question echoed louder than any sermon. Had the devil found a rhythm to ensnare the faithful? Outside, the faithful danced as if to confirm the worst fears of the church. Some spoke in tongues. Others wept even as their legs refused to stop. There were no melodies to follow, and yet their limbs seemed pulled by strings of invisible music. Children mimicked the adults, laughing with delight that curdled into terror as their laughter became tears. In sermons, preachers thundered from pulpits that the city was being punished for its pride, its vanity, its sins tucked behind lace curtains and golden chalices. They compared the dancers to the Israelites worshipping the golden calf, abandoning the divine for ecstatic abandon. To dance, in such chaos, was to tempt judgment. Whispers grew into proclamations. The devil, it was said, had entered Strasbourg, not through fire and brimstone, but through song. And his symphony was irresistible. Under this spiritual diagnosis, the church called for acts of purification. Holy water was sprinkled not just at altars, but over the public squares. Priests walked among the dancers with crucifixes, chanting psalms into the air heavy with sweat and despair. Exorcisms were performed, not in hushed chapels, but in the open air, beneath the watchful eyes of both the divine and the dying. Dancers were dragged to the cathedral steps, bound with ropes and prayed over with a ferocity born of desperation. Some foamed at the mouth, others convulsed, while others continued to sway despite every command to cease. Among the most striking efforts was the pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Vitus. Vitus, the patron saint of dancers and epileptics, became the city's last hope. The church ordered dozens of dancers transported, sometimes by wheelbarrow, to his shrine in the Vosges Mountains. There, in a chapel swaddled in incense and candlelight, priests prayed fervently that the saint would intercede. The rituals were intense. Offerings were made. Relics touched the foreheads of the afflicted. In many cases, the dancers were given red shoes and instructed to place their feet within the marks etched into the stone floor by pilgrims of centuries past. There, the dancing often ceased. The church claimed victory, but unease lingered. Was the cessation due to divine grace, or the sheer exhaustion of the body collapsing into stillness? Back in Strasbourg, the sermons changed. No longer did they speak only of punishment. They began to speak of mercy. The narrative was shifting. Where once there was only the devil, now there was God's testing hand, allowing suffering to draw his flock closer. But questions brewed quietly in the margins. If this was spiritual warfare, why were even the devout afflicted? If the church was the shepherd, why had its voice come so late to the chaos? And why had no prayer been strong enough to halt the dance on the very first day? Behind closed doors, the church convened once more. Some argued the plague had been a warning, others a punishment, but a few, daring in thought, wondered whether it was something else entirely, something neither saintly nor satanic, but deeply human. There was talk of collective madness, of stress and sorrow rippling through a society already wearied by famine, plague, and war. Could it be that what they had seen was not the devil's triumph, but humanity's breaking point? Such talk was dangerous. To challenge the narrative was to challenge the very scaffolding of divine order. And yet, the idea lingered. It would find its way into later manuscripts, marginalia, and whispers between scholars for generations to come. Thus, the church retreated, not in defeat, but in the heavy silence that follows mysteries unsolved. The bells of Strasbourg tolled again, this time not as warning, but as remembrance. For those who had danced, for those who had died, and for those still trying to understand why. The devil's tune had faded, but the echo lingered. Not in music, but in memory. In the quiet that followed, Strasbourg knelt and prayed, not for answers, but for peace. And thus, the spiritual lens dimmed, giving way to new theories, new interpretations, ones shaped not by miracles or malice, but by the fragile architecture of the human mind. They danced without rest, their feet battered by the relentless beat of a tune no one else could hear. The sun rose and fell, but the dancers did not stop. Their bodies trembled, drenched in sweat, muscles cramping, lungs heaving for air. Yet onward they swayed, turning the cobblestones red with blood, their faces glazed in ecstasy or agony. This was not dance for celebration. It was dance as punishment, as possession, a sentence without trial. By July of 1518, dozens in Strasbourg had fallen into the grip of the dance. Men and women, mostly women, it was whispered, were overtaken one by one. Some began with a few trembling steps, others collapsed only hours later. But it was their bodies, not their wills, that bore the brunt. And soon, the toll became impossible to ignore. Witnesses described dancers moving in jerky rhythms, their limbs flailing in chaotic disarray. Their eyes were often wide open, unblinking, staring into something unseen. They did not eat. They rarely drank. Sleep was a luxury they could not afford, for sleep required stillness, and their bodies betrayed them. Doctors and priests observed symptoms, both physical and spiritual. Feet blistered and split, ankles swelled, knees buckled, and hips dislocated under the weight of endless motion. Many collapsed from heat stroke or exhaustion. Some succumbed to heart failure. Others died from injuries sustained when they fell to the ground or collided with buildings, carts, or fellow dancers. And still, no one could stop them. The pain, it seemed, was irrelevant. Those afflicted appeared unaware of their injuries, moving on bleeding feet, arms hanging limp or spasming in uncontrollable rhythm. Some sang hymns as they danced. Others muttered prayers or howled in tongues unknown. For by now, many believed the body had become a battlefield between heaven and hell. There were those who claimed the dancers were possessed by demons, that evil spirits, perhaps summoned by sin or drawn by the scent of heresy, had taken residence in the flesh. Others suggested a divine punishment, a cleansing through suffering. The church called for exorcisms. The town council tried more earthly remedies, relocation, music therapy, and even prayer marches. But none of it cured the sickness that tore through the muscles and bones of the afflicted. Historical records are scarce in medical detail, but from what remains, letters, chronicles, physicians' notes, we can deduce the catastrophic physical consequences of this frenzied movement. Most suffered from rhabdomyolysis, a condition where muscle tissue breaks down and releases proteins into the bloodstream, poisoning the kidneys. Others likely died from heat exhaustion in the summer sun. And yet others, through sheer trauma to the heart, perished on their feet. Some sources estimate that as many as 15 people a day died during the peak of the plague. Others say that the deaths were fewer, but the affliction longer, dragging on into August, even September. The truth may lie somewhere in between, cloaked by time and rewritten by fear. What we do know is this: the human body was not designed for endless motion. And yet, for reasons no one could explain, it moved anyway. At night, families dragged their afflicted loved ones home, only to find them leaping from bed in the dark, compelled to return to the streets. In some accounts, dancers had to be tied down, even chained, to prevent further injury. Others were brought to shrines, St. Vitus being the most common, to pray for relief or healing. But often, the dancing resumed before the prayers had ended. Pain was not the only torment. The dancers' minds, too, bore wounds. Hallucinations were frequent. Some saw angels, others demons. Some described dreams in which they were forced to dance upon hot coals or swords. Some wept as they danced, mourning what they could not stop. Others laughed hysterically, caught in a fugue of joyless abandon. What strikes the modern mind is not just the physical toll, but the suffering accepted as divine or fated. There was no language for psychological illness, no framework for trauma or neurological compulsion. There was only the certainty that something had gone wrong, and that it must be answered. Some townspeople blamed the river. Some blamed the stars. Others whispered of witches who brewed storms of the mind. But no one blamed the dancers. They were not mocked, nor punished, nor locked away in shame. Instead, they were pitied, feared, and prayed for. Because deep down, everyone feared the same invisible string might one day tug at their own limbs. If the body was the instrument, and some cosmic force the unseen musician, who could say when it would begin to play again? In this chapter of the plague, the mystery deepened. Science had not yet reached Strasbourg streets. Medicine remained chained to the humors, to superstitions and sacred relics. And so, the suffering continued, day after day, week after week. Eventually, some dancers simply stopped. No one could say why. A few collapsed and never rose again. Others limped home, forever changed. Some were mute. Some walked with a limp. Some refused to speak of what they had seen while dancing. But all of them bore the mark of it. In bruises and burns, in broken bones and broken minds, they carried a story that words could never fully contain. And centuries later, we still ask the same questions. What drives the body to rebel against itself? What force bypasses the will and sends us into the fire of our own limbs? When the body becomes a stranger, what remains of the self? In the next chapter, we shall explore the theories that would later emerge, from medieval whispers to modern medicine, and attempt to make sense of the senseless. For though the dance has ended, the echoes remain. The cobblestones of Strasbourg are dry now, but once they were red with rhythm, and the bodies that moved upon them told a story that has never truly ceased. In the summer of 1518, as Strasbourg trembled beneath the relentless beat of unseen drums, another rhythm echoed through its vaulted cathedrals and candlelit chapels, a rhythm not of music, but of prayer. The church, ever present in the architecture of the city and the souls of its people, found itself facing a mystery that no canon law, no sacred relic, nor incense-laden liturgy could banish. For the people were dancing, and they would not stop. Not for rest, not for hunger, not even for the terror writ on their own faces. As city magistrates and physicians faltered, eyes turned upward, to heaven, to saints, and to sins. The church's first instinct, shaped by centuries of scholastic reasoning and apocalyptic fervor, was to interpret the dancing not as illness, but as penance. Here, before them, was not a plague of the body, but of the soul. The dancers were not victims, they believed, but sinners chosen to bear their guilt in the form of endless movement. Some monks whispered of the danse macabre, the medieval allegory of death, where skeletons led peasants and kings alike into the grave. Had this old symbol, carved in church frescoes and painted on monastery walls, stepped from metaphor into reality? Others thought of demonic possession. Had the devil himself set foot in Strasbourg, tempting the people into ecstatic frenzy, mocking Christ with a festival of flesh and exhaustion? The sermons grew darker. Yet even in its fear, the church sought remedy. The afflicted were brought before altars. Holy water was sprinkled upon their contorted forms. Hymns were sung with trembling voices as priests laid hands upon the dancers, pleading for divine intercession. When these failed, Strasbourg's bishops summoned a deeper power, the intercession of saints. In particular, the church turned to Saint Vitus, a martyr of early Christianity, long believed to possess the power to cure neurological afflictions, seizures, and, most pertinently, uncontrollable dancing. Thus, a pilgrimage was organized, not to Rome, not to the shrines of apostles, but to a lonely chapel dedicated to Saint Vitus, nestled in the hills beyond Strasbourg's city walls. It was here, in this modest sanctuary of stone and candlelight, that hope flickered like a flame. The afflicted were led, some barely able to stand, others still twitching in rhythm, to the shrine. There, priests performed rites of exorcism and prayer. Offerings were made. And finally, in a ritual both symbolic and physical, the dancers' feet were placed in red shoes, consecrated and anointed with holy oil. They were commanded to leave their burden at the altar, to dance no more. To some, the ritual worked. Or perhaps it coincided with the natural ebbing of the plague. For by late August, the dancing began to subside. The streets emptied. The music, whether imagined or real, faded into silence. In the aftermath, the church held its own quiet triumph. It was not physicians or magistrates who quelled the madness. They said, it was Saint Vitus. Faith had prevailed where reason failed. And yet, beneath this veneer of certainty, the questions remained. What sin, if any, had caused such a judgment? What divine plan required men and women to collapse in the street, eyes wide with fear and limbs beyond their control? Some theologians speculated that the city had fallen into pride. Others blamed heresy, or the influx of foreign travelers, or secret covens of witches. Still others, quietly, began to suspect that no such sin existed, that perhaps God had not sent the dancing at all. This last thought was dangerous, for it suggested a world less governed by divine justice and more by chaos. A world where suffering did not always have meaning. In monasteries, ink-stained scribes recorded the events in somber Latin. Marginalia in illuminated manuscripts show faint sketches, figures mid-motion, robes flying, feet blurred. Monks wrote of a Curia, a divine or infernal punishment visited upon the people. Over time, the legend of the dancing plague entered the chronicles of saints and martyrs. Strasbourg became a footnote in sermons, a cautionary tale, an echo of the biblical plagues. But for the ordinary faithful, the experience remained intimate and terrifying. Those who had witnessed their neighbors writhe in agony remembered not doctrine, but faces, not theology, but the sound of feet striking stone, hour after hour. And for those who had danced and survived, life did not resume untouched. Many carried physical injuries, swollen joints, twisted backs, damaged hearts. But worse were the dreams. Dreams of motion that never stopped, of music no one else could hear. One account tells of a woman who, though cured, kept her feet tightly bound each night in strips of linen, afraid they might move of their own accord. The church, in its wisdom and fear, absorbed the event into its canon of mystery. It declared that Strasbourg had been visited by divine correction, and then it moved on. But the questions it raised never fully disappeared. Beneath the marble floors of Strasbourg Cathedral, among saints carved in stone and sermons echoing through time, the silence grew heavy. What if suffering came not from sin, but from sorrow, from fear, from hunger, from years of quiet despair finally made visible in the only way the body knew? What if the dance was not punishment at all, but a scream, a protest no words could shape? As the next chapter unfolds, we move beyond the cloisters and sanctuaries, into the homes and hearts of the common people, the mothers, fathers, weavers, and shepherds who lived beneath the shadow of the plague. For if the church saw sin and the doctors saw imbalance, what did the people see? And what did they feel as their world danced on the edge of madness? In the echoing vaults of Strasbourg's cathedral, incense curled through cold air like ghostly vines. The flickering light of votive candles caught on the carvings of saints and martyrs, whose hollow eyes gazed down with mute resignation. Beneath their stone stairs, priests muttered incantations in Latin, their voices a murmur against the din of the world outside. And outside, the dancing still continued. By now, it had become more than spectacle. It was heresy, hysteria, or perhaps the devil's work. The church, long the arbiter of divine reason, was forced to confront this creeping absurdity. For if God was in heaven, and Strasbourg was his creation, then why did his people move in convulsive waves as if possessed? Why did they collapse with bloodied feet and hollow eyes, whispering of voices and visions that drove them to move until death took pity? The bishop's emissaries came bearing prayers and parchments. They examined the afflicted and proclaimed their bodies neither burned nor bruised by demonic marks. Their breath stank only of exhaustion, not brimstone. Their eyes, though vacant, did not glimmer with unholy fire. But still they danced. And so the church reached back through time to an older memory, a story wrapped in myth. St. Vitus, a Sicilian boy who, according to legend, refused to renounce his faith under Roman persecution. As punishment, he was boiled in oil, his limbs twisted in torment. But he did not scream. Instead, he laughed. Laughed, they said, until the demons fled. Centuries later, Vitus had become a protector of those who twitched and trembled. In the old beliefs, he was called upon to ease the writhing of epileptics, to hush the feet of dancers possessed by unseen spirits. And so the church now whispered, these were Vitus's people, not cursed, but caught. Caught in a sacred storm. A dance of pain meant not for scorn, but for pilgrimage. Thus, a procession was ordered. The afflicted would be gathered, not mocked or imprisoned, but led. They would be taken from the streets of Strasbourg and sent to the shrine of St. Vitus in the nearby town of Savre. There, beneath sacred relics and incense-laden air, perhaps they would find peace. The journey was strange. Led by robed monks and watched by wary crowds, the dancers moved in pained rhythm. Some collapsed before reaching the edge of town, but many staggered on, pulled by some unknown gravity. For them, the shrine was not a destination, it was a promise. A lullaby whispered across time. Saverne was a quiet place nestled in the Vosges, far from the thrum of panic. There, the dancers were brought into the chapel and made to kneel. Red shoes were placed upon their feet, laced with holy water and embroidered with the sign of the cross. The belief was simple. Let their final dance be sacred, not cursed. Let them move for healing, not torment. Miraculously, or perhaps predictably, many of them began to calm. Within the cool stone of the shrine, the frenzied pulses slowed. The rhythm that had once possessed them began to fade. Some wept, some collapsed, and others, silent and trembling, simply sat. The church called it divine intervention, a miracle, proof that faith, rightly channeled, could tame the wildest storm of the soul. But whispers lingered. Was it truly the shrine, or was it the journey? The shift away from public spectacle, the removal from contagion's eye? Could it be that the very attention given to the dancers had fueled the fire? In silence, a new question arose. If fear could spread like a flame, could faith also? Could belief be its own contagion, either to curse or to cure? In later writings, chroniclers would note that the plague dwindled after the pilgrimage. By autumn, the dance had all but ceased. Life resumed, slowly. Markets reopened. Weddings were held without tremors. The river flowed on as it always had, murmuring to reeds and ruins. Yet something had shifted. Strasbourg had changed, not in stone, but in spirit. A wound had opened and, though it had closed, the scar remained. The church, for all its authority, had been humbled. Science had not yet arisen to claim the moment. And so the mystery endured. Perhaps that was its true legacy. Not the dancing, nor the death, but the unsettling knowledge that there were forces beneath the skin of the world. Forces neither divine nor damned, but simply human. In this space, where faith met fear, the church carved its answer. And though the people nodded, lit candles, and sang hymns, part of them still glanced over their shoulders at the squares where the dancing had begun. Just in case. For who could say when rhythm might return? When feet might move again not from joy, but from some darker calling? And who among them would dare to dance? The sun rose gently over Strasbourg, casting pale ribbons of gold across the cobbled streets where once hundreds of feet had moved to an invisible rhythm. The frenzy had long ended. The music, if it had ever existed, was gone. All that remained was silence, dense, breathless, and inexplicable. The dancers had either fallen into stillness, recovered in mystery, or perished under the weight of exhaustion. But the city did not forget. The year 1519 opened with caution. Merchants opened their stalls slowly, as if movement itself were suspect. Children no longer played in the squares where the dancers had once convulsed. Priests avoided eye contact with physicians, and magistrates walked with heavy brows, weighed by guilt, by wonder, and by fear. No one spoke of the plague, yet everyone breathed in its shadow. No one truly knew when the dancing had stopped. There was no final song, no ceremonial last step. One morning, the rhythm simply dissolved. The afflicted fell into sleep, or into death, or into silence. The square was empty. The wooden stage, erected hastily at the city's expense, stood abandoned, its planks weathered and warped, now a roost for pigeons. What had once seemed an effort to heal had become a monument to confusion. For months after, the city's records grew thin. The council ceased documenting each case. Too many unknowns. Too many contradictions. It became easier to forget, or at least to try. And yet, even silence speaks. In forgotten corners of Strasbourg, voices murmured about spirits, about curses, about ancient rites returning through cracked stone. Women gathered herbs more nervously. Men avoided the riverside, where one dancer was said to have walked until her feet bled like lilies upon the stones. What, then, do we make of it now? 5 centuries have passed, and the question remains, what truly happened in 1518? Was it mass hysteria, a psychological echo chamber forged by stress, famine, and plague? Or was it something more intangible, a cultural rupture, an eruption of collective grief too immense for words, so it spilled instead in emotion? Some historians point to St. Vitus's dance, a known condition involving convulsions and tremors. But the Strasbourg episode defies neat categories. Its duration, its scale, its haunting choreography, none of it fits neatly into medical boxes. Others suggest poisoning. Ergot, the fungus that grows on damp rye, can produce hallucinations and spasms when consumed. It has been blamed for other strange episodes in history, the Salem witch trials, even visions in medieval monasteries. But again, ergot cannot explain the persistence of the plague, nor its peculiar rhythm. How does poison choreograph footsteps? How does it unify strangers in motion for weeks on end? There is, too, a spiritual interpretation, that the dancers were possessed, not by demons, but by something older, a memory buried in the collective human body. A ritual long forgotten, now resurrected through pain. In this view, the dancers were not mad, but mystics, pilgrims in their own flesh, vessels for ancestral sorrow. Perhaps the most poignant theory is the one of silent protest, that the people of Strasbourg, gripped by starvation, disease, and political violence, found no other outlet for their despair than movement. In a world where speech could get you punished, where complaints were seen as sedition, the body itself became the rebel. To dance was to cry without speaking. To collapse was to shout. The deeper we look, the more the dancing plague resists conclusion. It is a riddle in the shape of a tragedy. A chorus with no score. A funeral procession that became a performance. And still it echoes. In 2020, a global pandemic halted the world. Cities emptied. Streets fell silent. But behind closed doors, humans danced, on balconies, in kitchens, in digital windows. We returned to movement not as joy, but as survival. As if our bodies remembered something our minds had long forgotten. The dancing plague of 1518 reminds us that history is not always logical, that humans are creatures of rhythm as much as reason, that grief can take shape in the muscles, that sometimes The body becomes the only instrument through which truth can be expressed. In a way, the dancers left behind no monument, no carved stone, no cathedral spire. But they left an imprint deeper than architecture. They inscribed their mystery into time. And like all great enigmas, they ask something of us. Not answers, but presence, attention, reverence. Imagine them now, in your mind's eye. A woman in red, hair wild, feet bare, spinning under the pale moon. A boy of 12, arms aloft, lips murmuring prayers between spasms. An old man who had once fought in war, now caught in a rhythm he cannot break. They are not ghosts. They are us. For every age has its own dance, sometimes joyful, sometimes desperate. And in each movement, we carry the weight of our ancestors, their fears, their hopes, their hunger for meaning. So let us not close the book on Strasbourg. Let us return to that summer again and again, not to find answers, but to remember that the human heart, so fragile, so fierce, will always find a way to speak, even if it must do so with trembling feet, even if it must dance itself to death. In the quiet hush that follows the music of memory, we are left with the haunting echo of footsteps, feet that once moved in wild defiance of understanding, feet that spun and twirled into the veil between life and death. The story of the dancing plague of 1518 is not merely a tale of historical oddity. It is a mirror held to the human soul, fragile, fervent, and unfathomably complex. We began in the sweltering summer of Strasbourg, where cobbled streets bore witness to an invisible fever. A woman danced alone, and from her solitary trance, an epidemic of motion erupted. Doctors watched, priests prayed, and musicians played. Yet none could stop the rhythm that surged from the depths of something far older than science and far more elusive than logic. Through each chapter, we wandered not only through city squares and crumbling parchment, but through the corridors of fear and hope, trauma and transcendence. We saw the church's trembling grip on a changing world, the rise of reason against a tide of superstition, and the birth of early psychiatry drawn from medieval shadows. The dancers are long gone. Their names are lost to time. But their story survives, not in precise answers, but in the questions they leave behind. Why do people sometimes move beyond their own control? What ancient griefs still haunt the body when the mind cannot speak them? What collective pain finds expression in ritual, trance, and shared hysteria? To look at the dancing plague is to peer into a timeless riddle. It whispers of a world where body and soul, science and myth, despair and ecstasy are not separate threads, but a single woven tapestry. A world where a cry for help might emerge not in words, but in rhythm, in the stamping of heels against stone, in the whirling limbs of the afflicted. And perhaps that world is not so distant from ours. Today, we too struggle to name our anxieties, to soothe invisible wounds, to move in harmony with a world that spins too fast. We too seek meaning in chaos, sanctuary in song, and healing in motion. So let the story of 1518 not be forgotten in the dust of strange annals. Let it remind us that history is not a series of still images, but a dance, a movement of people through time, driven by forces they do not always understand. That somewhere, beneath all our modern armor, the ancient music still plays. And in moments of great fear, great longing, or great transformation, we may yet find ourselves moved by it. This has been the story of the dancing plague of 1518, where truth and mystery waltz together in the heart of history. May we listen, may we learn, may we never stop wondering.